Today, I'm going to talk about the Fragment class. Fragments were added to Android in version 3.0 to better support user interfaces for devices with large screens, such as tablets. Now, over the last few years, the popularity of tablets has grown incredibly. And as I'm sure you know, tablets have larger displays than phones typically do. So because of these larger screens, some of the design heuristics that made sense for a smaller phone display no longer work. And in particular, we can comfortably do much more on a large tablet display than we could do on a small phone display. Now, to put this in concrete terms, let's take a look at a simple application called Quote Viewer. Quote Viewer is an application comprised of two activities. The first activity shows the titles of several Shakespeare plays and allows the user to select one title at a time. And when the user selects that title, a second activity is started, which displays one quote from that play. Let's take a look. Now I'll launch the Quote Viewer application. The first activity starts up and shows us the titles of three Shakespeare plays: Hamlet, King Lear, and Julius Caesar. Let me click on Hamlet. This starts the second activity, which shows me Horatio's quote as Hamlet is dying. "Now cracks a noble heart. Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." Now I'll hit the back button to return to the titles. And next, I'll click on King Lear. And again, we get a quote. This time, one from the blinded Earl of Gloucester, who says, "As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport." And once again, I hit the back button to return to the titles. And this time, I click on Julius Caesar. And again, the second activity starts up, and we see a quote. This one where Brutus urges Cassius to go on the attack. He says, "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries." Now, this is a fine interface for a phone. In fact, it would be hard to do much else and still have a readable and easy-to-use interface. On a tablet, however, this same layout is pretty lame. Now here, let me show you. Here I'm showing an emulated tablet. I'll click on the launcher icon. And now I'll start the Quote Viewer application we just saw on the phone. And the first thing you notice is all that unused white space. The titles take up just a little space on the left side of the display, and the rest is pretty much wasted. Now let me click on Hamlet. And here you see that the quote stretches all the way across the 10-inch tablet, but uses little of the vertical space. Now I'll hit the back button to go back to the titles. And I can do the same thing for the King Lear quote. And the same thing for the Julius Caesar quote. Now, besides not using the available space too well, this layout imposes a slow back and forth navigation style where the user has to keep moving their hand from the title, then down to the back button, then back to the title, and so on. So let's see a better layout that uses both or shows both the titles and the quotes at the same time. I'll click on the launcher icon and then start up the Fragment Static Layout application. And this initially brings up a user interface that looks exactly like what you saw with the Quote Viewer application. However, when I click on the title, Hamlet, you see that the user interface gets essentially divided into two parts. The titles stay where they were on the left, but the quote is now shown simultaneously on the right side of the screen. And now, if I want to see a different quote, I simply select a new play title on the left. Here I'll select King Lear, and again, the quote pops up on the right. And the same thing when I select Julius Caesar. Now overall, this layout works much better on a tablet than Quote Viewer's layout does. In particular, it avoids wasted space and it makes navigation a little bit easier because I don't have to keep moving my hands down to the bottom of the display to hit the back button and then up to the titles and so on. The Quote Viewer application was made up of two activities. The Fragment static layout application that we just saw, however, is made up of a single activity. That single activity, however, hosts two fragments. Fragments represent a portion of an activity's user interface. The Fragment static layout application, for example, has two such interface portions. One for the titles, goes on the left, and one for the quotes, that goes on the right. And each of these portions of the user interface is implemented as a fragment. Fragments are hosted by activities. One activity can host 0 or more fragments, and one fragment can be used across 0 or more activities. Now, as I said, fragments are hosted by activities. So fragments have to be loaded into the activity and then displayed, removed, and so on as the activity changes its state. And as a result, the life cycle of a fragment is tied to and coordinated with the life cycle of the activity that's hosting it. At the same time, however, fragments have some of their own life cycle callbacks. For now, let's talk about the fragment lifecycle, assuming that the fragment is statically bound to its hosting activity. We'll talk about dynamically adding and removing fragments from a hosting activity a little bit later. So, a fragment can be in a running or resumed state. And when it's in this state, the fragment is visible in the running activity. A fragment can also be in a paused state. And fragments will be paused when their hosting activity is visible, but some other activity is in the foreground and has focus. A fragment can also be in a stopped state. In this state, the fragment is not visible. Let's talk now about the lifecycle callback methods that a fragment can receive. And we'll talk about when those methods might be called relative to the lifecycle states of the activity that hosts the fragment. When a fragment's hosting activity is being created, the fragment may receive several lifecycle method calls. First, when a fragment is attached to its hosting activity, the fragment receives a call to onAttach. Next, the fragment receives a call to its onCreate method. And note here that I'm referring to the fragment.onCreate method, not the activity.onCreate method that we've talked so much about in previous lessons. And as with the activity.onCreate method, you typically initialize the fragment in the fragment's onCreate method. One difference between the two methods, however, is that unlike in activity.onCreate, you don't set up the user interface in fragment.onCreate. That actually happens in the next method. Now, after onCreate, Android calls the fragment's onCreateView method. And this method sets up and returns a view containing the fragment's user interface. And this view is then given to the hosting activity so it can install that view in the activity's view hierarchy. And finally, after the hosting activity has been created and the fragment's user interface has been installed, then the fragment receives a call to its onActivityCreated method. Now, while the fragment is attached to the hosting activity, its lifecycle is dependent on its host's lifecycle. For example, if the hosting activity is about to become visible, it will receive a call to its onStart method. The fragment, therefore, will also receive a call to its onStart method. When the hosting activity is about to become visible and ready for user interaction, Android calls the fragment's onResume method. And when the hosting activity is visible, but another activity is about to come into the foreground, Android calls the fragment's onPause method. And when the hosting activity is no longer visible, the fragment receives a call to onStop. Now, when the hosting activity is about to be destroyed, any fragments that it's hosting also have to be shut down. And this happens in several steps. First, when the fragment's user interface view, the one that was previously created by the call to onCreate view, when that view has been detached from the activity, the fragment receives a call to onDestroy view. And here you can do things like clean up resources associated with the view. Next, when the fragment is no longer in use, it receives a call to its onDestroy method. And here you can do things like release fragment resources. Next, when the fragment is no longer attached to its hosting activity, it will receive a call to onDetach. And here you might do things like null out references to the fragment's hosting activity.